The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Dad lay there, his weathered hands folded over the thin blanket, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. At 68, he'd spent most of his life working our family farm, and those hands told the story of every season, every harvest, every repair made on equipment that should have been replaced decades. I pulled the plastic chair closer to his bed, the squeak of its legs against the linoleum floor seeming too loud in the quiet room. We both knew this was it. The cancer had spread faster than anyone expected, and the doctors had stopped talking about treatment options weeks ago. "Tommy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's when spotting trouble in the field, now seemed distant, focused on something I couldn't see. "Promise me you'll take care of the farm." I nodded, fighting back the tears that had been threatening all week. "Of course, Dad. The lawyer said everything's in order. The farm, the equipment, all of it." He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, regret or worry. "Just promise me you'll look after things proper. Really look after them." "I promise, Dad." He closed his eyes then, and I thought he might be drifting off to sleep. But then he spoke again, so quietly I had to lean in to hear him. "Check the old toolbox in the barn, behind the tractor, when you're ready." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but his breathing had already settled into the rhythm of sleep. 3 days later, he was gone. The funeral was everything you'd expect for a man who'd lived his whole life in a small farming community. Half the county showed up, sharing stories about Dad's generosity, his willingness to help neighbors in need, his knowledge of the land that seemed to go deeper than science or education could explain. But through it all, his last words echoed in my mind. "Check the old toolbox in the barn." Chapter 2. Coming home to the farm. Driving up the gravel road to the farmhouse felt different. The same oak trees lined the drive, their branches creating the familiar canopy that had sheltered my childhood. The white farmhouse sat exactly as it always had, with its wraparound porch and the wooden swing where Dad used to sit in the evenings, planning the next day's work. But everything felt hollow without him. I parked next to the red barn that had stood on this land for over a century. Dad's grandfather had built it with his own hands, using timber from the woods that used to cover the back 40 acres. The John Deere 40C20 sat where it always did, just outside the main doors. That tractor had been Dad's pride and joy, a 1970 model he'd bought used when I was 10 years old and had maintained meticulously ever since. I'd grown up expecting that tractor would be mine someday. Dad had taught me to drive it when my feet could barely reach the pedals, showed me how to maintain the engine, how to read the subtle sounds that meant something needed attention. In my mind, inheriting that tractor was like inheriting a piece of Dad himself. The house felt impossibly quiet as I walked through, memories attached to every piece of furniture, every family photo on the... Mom had been gone for 8 years now, and Dad had kept everything exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table next to a book she'd never finished. I made myself a cup of coffee using Dad's old percolator and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at the fields. 200 acres of some of the best farmland in the county, according to Dad. Corn and soybeans mostly, though he'd always kept a small vegetable garden near the house that produced enough to feed half the neighborhood. The lawyer had been clear about the inheritance. Everything came to me. The land, the house, the equipment. Dad had no other family, and I was his only child. It was straightforward, he'd said. Nothing complicated about it. But Dad's words nagged at me. Why would he tell me to check an old toolbox? What could possibly be in there that mattered more than everything else we'd already discussed? Chapter 3. The familiar weight of the barn. I finished my coffee and walked out to the barn, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the farmyard. The familiar smell of hay, motor oil, and well-worn leather hit me as soon as I opened the doors. This place held more memories than anywhere else on the farm. Dad had taught me to work on engines here, to repair equipment, to understand that taking care of your tools was just as important as knowing how to use them. The John Deere sat like a monument to 40 years of faithful service. Dad had repainted it just last spring, the same bright green and yellow it had worn when he first brought it home. Every surface was clean, every bolt properly tightened. Even now, with Dad gone, the tractor looked ready for another day's work. I walked around it slowly, running my hand along the fender where I used to sit as a kid, pretending to help with whatever job Dad was working on. He'd been endlessly patient with my questions, my eagerness to be involved in everything he did. Behind the tractor, against the far wall of the barn, sat Dad's old red toolbox. It was a massive craftsman chest from the 1980s that had seen decades of heavy use. I'd been in that toolbox thousands of times, but I'd never found anything unusual until now. It wasn't until I got to the bottom drawer that I discovered something different. Tucked behind a collection of spare hydraulic fittings was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with brittle tape. My name was written on the front in Dad's careful handwriting. For Tommy. Chapter 4. The envelope that changed everything. I sat down on an overturned milk crate next to the toolbox, holding the envelope in hands that had started to shake slightly. Dad's handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script he'd used to label parts bins and keep maintenance records for every piece of equipment on the farm. The envelope was thick, clearly containing more than just a letter. I carefully peeled away the old tape, trying not to tear the paper underneath. Inside, I found several documents folded together, and a smaller sealed envelope marked, "Read this first." The smaller envelope contained a single sheet of Dad's personal stationery, the kind Mom had given him years ago that he only used for important occasions. The letter was dated just 6 months before his diagnosis. "Tommy," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I asked you to find. I hope you'll forgive an old man for keeping secrets, but some things are easier to explain in writing than face to face." My heart was pounding as I continued reading. "The farm isn't going to you, son. It's going to Maria Santos, her family. All the legal papers are in this envelope, along with the deed transfer and my updated. I know this isn't what you expected, and I know you're probably angry with me right now, but I need you to understand why." I had to stop reading. Maria Santos? I knew the name. She was the woman who had been helping Dad with housekeeping and cooking the past 3 ever since his arthritis had made it harder for him to manage everything on his own. But why would Dad leave the farm to... I forced myself to keep reading. Maria came to this country with nothing but her 2 children and a dream of giving them a better life. She's worked harder than anyone I've ever known, sending money back to her family in Mexico while saving every penny she could to try to buy a small place of her own someday. The letter went on to explain that Maria's oldest son, Carlos, was graduating high school in the spring with plans to study agriculture in college. Her daughter, Sophia, was only 14, but already showing interest in veterinary medicine. Dad had been watching this family struggle and sacrifice for years, and he'd made his decision. "The farm will give them the chance they deserve," the letter continued. "Carlos knows farming. I've been teaching him for 2 years now. He understands the land, respects it, and Maria. She understands what it means to work for something, to value what you have." Chapter 5. Questions Without Easy Answers. I sat in that barn for an hour, reading and rereading Dad's letter, trying to process what felt like a complete rewriting of my life's assumptions. The farm I'd grown up on, the land I'd expected to inherit, the future I'd planned. All of it was gone, signed away to a family I barely knew. The anger came first, hot and immediate. How could Dad do this to me? How could he make such a massive decision without even discussing it with me? I was his son, his only child. This farm was my birthright, my heritage. But as I sat there surrounded by the tools and equipment that had defined so much of my relationship with my father, other feelings began to creep in. Confusion, certainly, hurt, but also something else I couldn't quite name. A nagging sense that there was more to this story than I understood. I looked at the other documents in the envelope. The deed transfer was official and notarized, dated just 2 months before Dad went into the hospital. The updated will was equally legal and binding. Everything had been done properly, with a lawyer's signature confirming that Dad was of sound mind when he made these decisions. But there was something else in a smaller piece of paper with what looked like an address written in Dad's handwriting. 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. Below the address, he'd written, "Talk to Maria. She'll explain better than I can." I knew Oak Street. It was in town, about 15 minutes away, in one of the older neighborhoods where most of the rental properties. I'd driven past it countless times, but never paid much attention to the apartment. Dad's letter ended with a paragraph that made my chest tight. "I know you're hurt, son, and I'm sorry for that. But I raised you to be the kind of man who understands right from wrong, who helps people when they need help. This family needs help, and we have the means to provide it. That's what your mother would have wanted, and it's what I believe is right. The farm will be in good hands. I promise you that." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. The John Deere sat there gleaming in the afternoon light filtering through the barn windows, looking exactly as it always had. But everything else had changed completely. Chapter 6. The Drive to Oak Street. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking around the farm, seeing it through different eyes. The cornfields that stretched to the eastern property line, the old farm pond where Dad had taught me to fish, the machinery shed where we'd spent countless hours working on equipment together. All of it would belong to someone else. The rational part of my mind understood that I needed to respect Dad's wishes, that he'd made his decision for reasons he believed were important. But the emotional part of me felt betrayed, cut off from the only life I'd ever known or wanted. As evening approached, I made the decision to drive to Oak Street. I needed to understand what Dad had seen in this family that made him willing to give them everything he'd worked for his entire life. 1247. Oak Street turned out to be a 3-story brick building in need of repair. I climbed to the 3rd floor and found apartment 3B. Through the thin walls, I could hear voices speaking Spanish and the sound of cooking. I knocked gently, unsure what I would say. The door opened to reveal Maria Santos, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore scrubs and looked tired from a long day of work. "Mrs. Santos?" I asked. Her expression immediately changed to one of concern, mixed with recognition. "Tommy, is that you?" I nodded, suddenly feeling awkward and unsure. "I wonder if we could talk. About my father, about the farm." She stepped back and gestured for me to come in. "Of course, please come in." The apartment was small but immaculately clean. The furniture was minimal and well-worn, but everything was organized and cared for. Family photos covered one wall, and I could see textbooks stacked on a small desk in the corner. "Carlos! Sophia!" Maria called. "Come meet Tommy." Chapter 7. Meeting the Santos family. Carlos appeared first, emerging from what must have been a bedroom with a textbook. He was tall for his age, maybe 17, with his mother's dark eyes and a firm handshake when he introduced himself. Behind him came Sophia, a petite girl with long black hair who smiled shyly, but confidently met my eyes. "I'm so sorry about your father," Maria said, gesturing for me to sit on their small couch. He was like family to us." Carlos nodded earnestly. "Mr. Thompson taught me so much about farming, about taking care of the land. He was very patient with all my questions." I looked around the small apartment, trying to understand how this family had become so important to Dad that he'd entrust them with his life's work. "He mentioned you in a letter," I said carefully. "About the farm." Maria's expression grew serious. "We need to talk about that, don't we?" She sent the kids to their room and made coffee while I sat in their small living room, looking at the family photos on the wall. Many of them showed Carlos and Sophia at various ages, but there were others too. An older couple I assumed were Maria's parents, and several photos of what looked like extended family back in Mexico. When Maria returned with the coffee, she sat across from me and took a deep breath. "Your father talked to me about his decision many times before he made it official. I told him he should discuss it with you first, but he said you would try to talk him out of it. He might have been right about that, I admit. He loved you very much, Tommy. He talked about you all the time, how proud he was of you, how hard you worked, how much you cared about doing the right thing, but he also worried about you." That surprised me. "Worried about me? Why?" Maria sipped her coffee, choosing her words carefully. "He said you'd been talking about leaving the farm, maybe moving to the city, starting a different kind of career. He said you only stayed because you thought it was expected of you, not because it was what you really wanted." Chapter 8. Uncomfortable Truths. The conversation with Maria that evening forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. She was right. I had been thinking about leaving the farm, about finding a career that felt more like my own choice rather than inherited obligation. I'd even had a few interviews with engineering firms in the state capital, though I'd never mentioned them to Dad. "Your father said he didn't want you to feel trapped by the farm. He wanted you to be free to choose your own path." Carlos appeared in the doorway, hesitating as if unsure whether to. Maria waved him in, and he sat on the edge of a chair, clearly wanting to be part of the conversation. "Mr. Thompson helped me understand so much about sustainable farming practices," Carlos said earnestly, "about soil conservation and crop rotation. He said the farm needed someone who would love it for the long term, someone who would see it as their future, not their burden." The way he talked about the farm with genuine enthusiasm and detailed knowledge reminded me of Dad when he was explaining some new technique or talking about the seasonal rhythms of agriculture. I could see why Dad had been impressed with this young man. Sophia joined us too, and Maria explained that she'd been working 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and working the night shift at the nursing home, to save money for her children's education. The family sent part of their income back to Mexico to support Maria's elderly parents, but they'd still managed to save nearly $15,000 toward the down payment on a small farm. "Your father found out about our savings," Maria said with a slight smile. "He said anyone who could save that much money while supporting 2 families and raising 2 children on what I make as a housekeeper deserved a chance to farm." I sat there listening to this family talk about their dreams, their work ethic, their love for the land that Dad had taught them to understand and respect, and slowly, I began to see what Dad had seen. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would continue to let you help with the house and the cooking," I said to Maria. "He never told me he was planning to give you the farm." Maria nodded. "He wanted to make sure you were ready to hear it." Chapter 9. A Different Kind of Legacy. Over the following days, I spent time with the Santos family, learning their story and understanding Dad's decision. Carlos showed me detailed notebooks about the farm, soil tests, crop rotation plans, maintenance schedules. His knowledge was impressive and his passion evident. Sophia shared her science projects and dreams of veterinary medicine. I began to see what Dad had recognized in this family: clear goals, specific plans, and the work ethic to achieve them. Meanwhile, I'd been going through the motions of farm life while secretly planning my escape. Dad had seen that, even when I thought I was hiding it. I drove out to the farm every day that week, walking through the fields and thinking about what Dad had really wanted to leave behind. The land itself was important, certainly, but what mattered more was ensuring that his life's work would continue in the hands of people who valued it, who would build on what he'd created rather than just maintain it. On Thursday evening, I was in the barn working on a minor repair to the tractor when Carlos showed up with a toolbox of his own. "Mind if I help?" he asked. "Your dad was teaching me about engine maintenance." We worked together for a couple of hours, and I found myself explaining things the same way Dad had taught them to me. Carlos asked good questions and caught on quickly. When we finished, the tractor was running better than it had in months. "Your father said this tractor has at least 20 more years of good work in it," Carlos said, patting the green fender affectionately. He showed me all the maintenance records going back to when he first bought it. Chapter 10. Understanding the Real Gift. That night, I called my best friend Mark, who lived in the city and worked as a software. I'd been considering his offer to help me get an in with his company, and I needed to talk through what was happening. "So let me get this straight," Mark said after I explained the situation. "Your dad left the farm to a family you barely know, and you're actually considering supporting his decision?" When he put it like that, it did sound crazy, but I tried to explain what I'd learned about the Santos family, about their work ethic and their dreams, and their genuine love for farming. "But it's your inheritance, man," Mark said. "Your birthright. Doesn't that matter?" I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Was inheritance really about blood and birthright? Or was it about finding the right people to carry forward what you'd built? The next morning, I drove to Dad's lawyer's office in town. Robert Peterson had been Dad's attorney for 20 years. He was expecting. "I assume you found the documents in the barn," he said, settling back in his chair behind a desk covered with legal files. "You knew about this the whole time?" "Your father asked me to prepare the paperwork about 6 months ago. I advised him to discuss it with you first, but he was adamant about doing it this way. Said you needed time to see the family for yourself before you'd understand his reasoning." Robert explained that Dad had set up a small trust fund for enough to buy a house in the city and have some security while I started a new career. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough to give me the fresh start I'd been secretly wanting. "He also left you something else," Robert said, pulling a small envelope from his desk drawer. "He said to give this to you after you'd had a chance to meet the Santos family." Inside was a key and a note. "The John Deere is yours, son. Take it wherever you go. Every farmer needs a good tractor." Chapter 11. The Value of What Remains. I drove back to the farm with Dad's final gift in my pocket, trying to process the mix of emotions washing over. He'd known me better than I'd known myself, understanding that I needed permission to leave as much as I needed something to take with me. The John Deere sat in the barn exactly where it always had, but now I saw it differently. This wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. It was Dad's way of telling me that no matter where I went or what I did, I'd always carry the lessons he'd taught me about hard work, responsibility, and taking care of what matters. Carlos was in the barn when I arrived, organizing tools in preparation for the spring planting season. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I talked to the lawyer," I told him. "Everything is official. The farm is yours, your family's." His face broke into a grin that reminded me of myself at his age, when Dad would let me drive the tractor or trust me with an important repair. "Thank you," he said simply. "We won't let your father down. I know you won't." I explained about the trust fund Dad had left me, about my plans to move to the city and start a career in engineering. Carlos listened intently, and when I finished, he asked a question that surprised me. "Would you mind if I asked for your advice sometimes? About the farm? About decisions that come up?" I realized then that this didn't have to be a complete ending. The farm would belong to the Santos family, but the knowledge and experience I'd gained growing up here didn't have to die with that transfer. I could still be connected to this place and these people, just in a different way. "I'd like that," I told him. "I'd like that a lot." Maria appeared in the barn doorway, having heard our voices. She looked between us with an expression of hope and concern. "Everything's going to work out," I told her. Dad made the right choice. Chapter 12. A New Understanding. The next few weeks passed in a blur of arrangements and adjustments. I accepted the job offer in the city and found a small house with enough garage space for the John Deere. It seemed absurd to bring a farm tractor to the suburb, but it was Dad's gift, and I was going to honor it. The Santos family moved into the farmhouse on a warm Saturday in early May. I helped them load their belongings from the small apartment and watched as Carlos and Sofia explored their new home with wonder and excitement. For them, this wasn't just a house. It was the foundation for every dream they'd been working. Maria found Dad's reading glasses on the kitchen table, exactly where he'd left them the day he went into the hospital for the last time. She held them carefully, as if they were precious artifacts. "He sat right here every morning," she said softly, "reading the weather report and the commodity prices, planning his day." I showed her Dad's office, where he kept all the farm records and business files. Everything was organized and labeled, ready to be passed on to someone who would continue the work. Carlos studied the crop rotation charts and soil analysis reports with the same intensity I remembered bringing to baseball statistics as a kid. Sophia discovered Dad's collection of books about agriculture and animal husbandry, her eyes lighting up as she realized how much information was available to support her veterinary ambition. Watching them settle into the farmhouse, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. This felt right in a way that surprised me. The farm was continuing, the work was continuing, but it was being carried forward by people who chose it rather than inherited it. That evening, as the Santos family prepared their first dinner in their new home, I walked out to the barn one last time as the owner's son. Tomorrow, I'd still be welcome here, but my relationship to this place would be different. The John Deere sat ready for its journey to the city, looking slightly out of place, but somehow proud of its new adventure. I ran my hand along the fender one more time, remembering all the hours Dad and I had spent working together, learning together, building the relationship that had shaped who I became. Chapter 13. The Legacy That Matters. 6 months later, I was settling into my new life in the city, working as a junior engineer at a firm that specialized in renewable energy projects. The work was challenging and engaging in ways I'd never experienced, and I woke up each morning excited about what I'd be learning and building. The John Deere sat in my garage, cleaned and maintained exactly as Dad had taught me. My neighbors thought I was eccentric for keeping a farm tractor in suburbia, but I didn't care. Every weekend, I'd start it up and listen to the familiar rumble of the engine, remembering Dad's voice as he explained the intricacies of diesel engines and hydraulic systems. Carlos called me regularly with questions about the farm, and I made the drive back every few weeks to see how things were progressing. The farm was thriving under his care, and his enthusiasm for the work reminded me why Dad had loved it so much. Sophia was excelling in her pre-veterinary studies, and Maria had been able to quit her night job at the nursing home to focus on managing the farm's business operations. They'd even started a small farmer's market business, selling vegetables and preserves made from Dad's old recipes. But the real revelation came during one of my visits in late fall. I was helping Carlos prepare the equipment for winter storage when he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Your father told me something once that I think about all the time," he said, adjusting the belt tension on the combine harvester. He said the best gift you can give someone isn't something they want, but something they need to become who they're meant to be. I realized then that Dad hadn't just given the farm to the Santos family. He'd given me permission to become who I was meant to be too. The farm had been his life's work, but forcing me to inherit it would have been asking me to live his life rather than mine. The trust fund had given me financial security, but more importantly, his blessing had given me emotional freedom. The John Deere had given me a tangible connection to everything he taught me about work and responsibility, and knowing that the farm was in good hands had given me peace about the path I'd chosen. Standing in that barn, watching Carlos work with the same careful attention to detail that Dad had always shown, I finally understood what my father had really wanted to leave behind. It wasn't land or equipment or even money. It was the knowledge that his work would continue, that the values he'd tried to instill in me would be carried forward, and that everyone involved would have the chance to build the life they were meant to live. Thank you for listening to my story about discovering what my father really wanted to leave behind. Sometimes the most important inheritances aren't what we expect them to be. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening to this story? And if this resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more real-life stories about family, legacy, and the unexpected ways life teaches us what really matters.